So we have Steve Gravely here. He is the founder and CEO of Gravely Group, an illustrious law firm. Steve is was one of the proud founders and authors of the DRSA, as well as, I believe, the Carry Quality Connected Agreement, and definitely one of the major inputters and authors of TEFCA, the Trusted Exchange Framework Common Agreement. So Steve, I've stolen your clicker to move forward if you choose to use it.
Oh, well, yeah, you have to, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's talk TEFCA. Good morning, everybody. I've never been compared to Thomas Jefferson. I've been called a lot of things. That's a first. But as a lifelong Virginian and a graduate of the College of William and Mary, I'll take it. Okay, so, I know that if you've been here 3 days or 3 minutes, you know what TEFCA is. And don't blame me. I didn't write the Cures Act. I can promise you that. So we're going to move through some really rapidly, just some baseline, in case there's anyone in the room that isn't familiar with TEFCA. So you've probably seen these slides before. These are from ONC, the RCE, and if you've participated in any of the webinars, and I'm not sure there's anyone in the U.S. that hasn't, then you've seen these. But they're important. Obviously this all starts with the Cures Act, right? All the way, as Mickey was talking about yesterday or the day before. And so we have the common agreement that is the legal foundation for the network that will be TEFCA. And then if you've read the common agreement, there's a lot there. And if you put the common agreement and the DRSA side by side, you're going to immediately notice that the common agreement is more detailed, more granular. And that's very intentional. The DRSA was not the starting point for the common agreement. The Carry Quality Connected Agreement was the starting point for the common agreement, as were the MRTCs that ONC published. I can't remember when. It's been a while. All right, so we have the common agreement, and there's a lot there. But of course, there's always more. And so the SOPs are very important, standard operating procedures. They're very important in terms of drilling down on a lot of the operational detail. The QTF that my friend Dave Castle birthed, and along with a lot of help from many people, that's the technical framework. And then there are SOPs that supplement the QTF. And then we have the onboarding process, the entire metrics universe that ONC is really emphasizing with TEFCA, which I think is a great idea, because hopefully it will give us all some valuable quantification of what TEFCA is doing. And then, of course, governance. Now, here are the 3 goals. You've heard them before. I'm not going to linger on those, so we have a lot of other stuff to cover. But this is why we're doing TEFCA. I'm sure you've seen the umbrella. It's now famous, and so eHealth Exchange, as Jay said, has applied, and we are cautiously optimistic that we will be approved and become a designated QHIN along with others. And so we'll be one of the little black circles there under the umbrella, along with whomever else. And then the little aqua circles would be many of you, and a bunch of you are going to be QHINs as well, but many of you, some number of the 337 will become aqua circles, and there'll be TEFCA participants through the eHealth Exchange QHIN. Some of you will be participants through another QHIN, and it's all good. So, if you don't know this by now, see me after, and we can talk about that. But I think you're probably familiar with this. So I want to shift into this whole topic of flow downs that Jay talked about, and then shift into how, and Jay and I will tag team, how this eHealth plan to implement TEFCA, provided that it's designated. And I'm not going to keep saying that because it's a little bit annoying. So, but if you've read the common agreement, you know that in the actual text of the CA, certain sections have a bold parenthetical that says required flow down. And that was very intentional. It may seem odd to some of you that that's in a contract, right? But that was very intentional because ONC wanted to be sure that the flow downs were very transparent to the reader. And so I know it's something I hadn't done before, but like, yeah, sure. So, so that's the first inkling in the common agreement of what's required to be flowed down. And required is the word. It's not optional. It's mandatory that every QHIN flow these things down. And now how a QHIN decides to do that, there is some flexibility in terms of how they do it. But every QHIN will be doing the same thing in terms of flowing these down. So if anyone thinks they're going to go shopping for a QHIN that doesn't, flow the requirements down, that won't happen. We didn't want a secondary market in shopping for a friendlier, QHIN for that. And so, and then some of those flow downs stop at the participant level, but many of them continue down the chain to the sub-participant level, the sub-participant level, and theoretically, it should be infinite. It won't be, but, and so it gets murky. I will say that. So here are the required flow downs. This is literally lifted from the common agreement. You can go back and cross-check. But these are the sections that ONC says have to be flowed down. And again, every QHIN has the same requirement. And so, cooperation, you'll see that in the DRSA, you'll see that in the CCA, Care Quality Connected Agreement, and you'll certainly see it in the common agreement, where the parties to that agree to work with each other. Because interoperability is a team sport. No one can do it by themselves, right? And so cooperation really is important. The prohibition against exclusivity is a little bit interesting because ONC seems to be migrating its policy a bit. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that. And we don't really have time to dive into these. But these are the flow downs. SOPs, there are a lot of them. So as I said before, the common agreement itself is very robust. There's a lot of detail in the common agreement. And yet we have a very robust set of SOPs. So the SOPs really are intended to say to everyone, look, this is we're talking the common agreement about governance. And then there's a transitional council for the first 12 months, and then there's a permanent governing council after the first 12 months, because we know there's going to be a ramp-up time during 23. And then there are advisory groups, but we didn't want to put all the mechanics of that in the CA because this is a dynamic environment, right? And things do change, they will change. And so much of the detail about the governing council, the transitional council, the advisory groups, that's in the SOP. And those can be amended more easily than the common agreement. I'm not saying it's easy, but more easily than the common agreement. And so you see, dispute resolution, the exchange purposes, SOP, and as Jay said, there are specific exchange purposes. QHINs, in order to be designated, they have to be able to support every exchange purpose, but treatment and individual access are the only exchange purposes that are required out of the gate. But a QHIN has to be able to support them all because some of their participants or sub-participants might choose to do another exchange purpose. They're not required to, but they might choose to, and that's why QHINs have to be ready to support all of them. And I'm sure there will be more of them that are supported. So ownership and control, not really an issue for us, and probably not an issue for the folks who were on the stage yesterday or the day before. But anyway, you see the SOPs. So these are final on the left. On the right, the common attractions. I'm not going to read it to you. You can see it yourself. The number 15 is really interesting. This is the participant and sub-participant security SOP. So these are the security requirements that will apply not to eHealth or someone else, but to every QHIN's participants and those participants, sub-participants on down the line. That draft was just released, and comments are due January the 13th. I encourage you to look at that. I know it's the holiday, but it's the office of no Christmas, so, but I encourage you to look at that. Whether you're, I know the QHINs are looking at it, but if you're even thinking about participating with us or one of the other QHINs, you really want to look at that because you'll be taking on those obligations, as will your customers, and you might have comments. I would expect you will have comments. And so you have a few weeks still to submit those to ONC. And as you heard Mickey say, and I just want to reiterate, having been on the inside for a while, every comment is read, and every comment is dispositioned. And not every comment leads to a change, right? But your comments are not ignored. So I do encourage you to review that draft and comment on it if you want to. And there'll be some other very important SOPs coming down the line. And the fact that the RCE has publicly stated that they're going to be publishing the payment and operations SOP, the public health SOP, and the government benefits SOP, I think is significant. I believe it tells us that ONC and the RCE intend to prioritize that sooner instead of later. I have no inside information, but logic, right? All right, so let's talk about governance. This was one that when I was working directly with the RCE and ONC up until 30 April of this year, when we stepped away in order to not have a conflict of interest with eHealth, we spent a lot of time talking about this, a lot of time talking about governance, and trying to get this right. How do we get this right? And we anticipated that there would be some number, it looks like it'll be 5 or 6, maybe more, I'm not sure, that will be early adopters. And then there will probably be others that say, well, okay, looks like this may actually work. So now I want to be a human, right? Or I want to be a participant. And so we built in this concept of a transitional governance model really for the first year. Think about it this way. Let's just hypothesize that the first 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 QHENs are approved, their applications are approved in Q1 of 23. And then, of course, they each have the 12 months to complete the required testing. Doesn't have to take that long, but everyone has that. And then they're designated. So it's not unreasonable to think that we will have designated QHENs in 2023. So at that point, however many there are, they will appoint a representative to serve on this transitional council. I think it's pretty safe to say there will be fewer than 10 at this point. And, but we didn't know. And so we arbitrarily, I say we, this was back when I was working with ONC and RC, we capped it at 10. And so assuming there are fewer than 10 QHENs designated initially, then those get to appoint a representative to the transitional council. And I think you heard when the QHEN panel was up here, there were questions about, well, why are you doing this? And what's, why are you doing this first? And part of the answer was, well, we want to be able to help make this successful. We want to be an early adopter. And so this is really the early adopter governance model. And then each QHEN will appoint one individual from its participant ranks and one from its sub-participant ranks. And then the RC, of course, has a seat. And that becomes your initial governing council. And through SOP, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to confuse that. And so this group will only be in place for 12 months. It's really how do we get started, governing council. And no doubt, and you heard this, I think Dave Castle said it, I thought it was perfect. We are kind of building the plane as we're taking off. and we've all done that. Everybody in this room has done that before. And so that's okay, actually. That's not terrible. And so the governing council, I think, is going to work very hard. I remember the early days of the coordinating committee back in 09, 10, and 11. And there were long meetings and really wrestling with a lot of issues. So I believe that whoever is on this council they'll earn their cookies and coffee. And then a big part of what this council does is they will develop the transition plan to the permanent governance, which this slide represents. And we did just sort of say, all right, look, this is a 12-month time period, so there was no uncertainty. And so everybody knows, we have our initial 12 months, and then at that, we go to our permanent council, and you see that here, it's much larger, up to 21. And we have this idea of a QHEN caucus, and if any of you have done lobbying or legislative work, you know what that is. A QHEN caucus and a sub-participant caucus. Now, that may seem a little over-engineered to some of you right now, but if we think to a future state where there are 30 QHENs and hundreds of participants and sub-participants, the caucus is a way, it's a means, it's not the only way, but it's a way to have participatory representative democracy so that everyone has a voice in who is appointed to the governing council. So it may seem a little bit heavy if there are 5 Q-hens, but I think we'll be much beyond that. So that's why we had this structure. There are 2 co-chairs intentionally, again, to try to instantiate this idea of representation and participation. So there's not, so the Q-hens don't dominate governance, which some people worry about. Quorum is 2/3, so it's a supermajority quorum, again, intentional, because we want people there engaged to make these important decisions. And if they're not there and you don't have a quorum, then that points to a bigger problem within your body. And this forces you to address that problem. Why aren't people there? But then once you have a quorum, it's simple majority to approve whatever motion is before you. I talked about the caucus a little bit. I won't repeat that. I'm sorry I do that. But in terms of the Q-hen caucus, a Q-hen can appoint up to 3 of its participants and sub-participants to sit on the caucus. And so, that could be a pretty big caucus, right? And we'll see how it plays out. The QTF, I'm sure you all are familiar with this already. So with that, Jay, I think you and I are going to start tag teaming, right? Am I doing this one? I'm sorry. Okay. It's been a busy 3 days. So now we're out of the generic, and we're into how is eHealth Exchange approaching this. So the eHealth Exchange, in our last DRSA amendment, we implemented this model, an opt-out model. So some of you who are participants will remember that when the coordinating committee approved becoming an implementer of care quality, eHealth provided notice to all, I think it was 303 at the time, all the participants, hey, eHealth is now a care quality implementer. And they provided the TEFCA terms, and they provided some background on care quality, and they said, you now have the opportunity to opt out. If you don't want to be in care quality through the eHealth Exchange because you're an Epic shop and you're already in care quality through Epic, or you're Commonwealth and you're already in care quality through Commonwealth, or some other reason, then opt out. And so there were a number that adopted out for obvious reasons. And so that's the model that the eHealth Exchange follows. Every Q-hen's different. That's our model. And if you don't opt out, then you're in. So same thing will apply here. We will be sending to the participants a package that will include these things on the screen so that people can make an informed decision. And then they'll have a time period, I think it's 60 days, to opt out. And if they don't opt out, then they will be deemed to have opted in to be a Q-hen participant. Now, if at day 80 they say, oh my goodness, or words to that effect, what have I done? They can still opt out. This is not a speak now or forever hold your peace type of thing. But it's a time period to try and have some predictability, right? And then obviously staff will keep the coordinating committee apprised. So that's something that we will launch, I guess Q1 23. I don't know, but that will be dictated by the RCE's pace. So that will be coming. Part of that package will be what we are calling the TEFCA terms and conditions. That's just the eHealth Exchange label. Other Q-hens will probably call it something else. but this is the way eHealth is going to inform its participants about the required flow downs. And so we saw those flow downs earlier. It will be a document, and it will lay them all out and say, if you don't opt out, then you will be expected to comply with these terms and conditions. Again, very similar to what care quality does today. But then our terms and conditions are going to go a little bit beyond just a regurgitation of the required flow downs. We're also going to, through our protocols, we're going to hopefully help participants understand, all right, here's your requirement, and here are some ways you might want to do it. We're not trying to overwhelm people. And so we're spending a lot of time trying to develop suggested approaches, or this is what this means. And then, of course, Jay and his staff, as always, are tremendous resources. But it won't just be, all right, here we go. Here's the list. Good luck. There'll be commentary and hopefully helpful guidance on how you might consider making sure that you're in compliance with this. And I just mentioned the protocols. And again, protocols is our term. Terms and conditions is ours, protocol is ours. That's not RCE language. That's just the way, that's our vocabulary for it. And so our goal is to not burden our participants and their sub-participants with having to spend a lot of time and lawyer money, because people like me are not cheap and we're a pain. But we're, you will certainly want your lawyers involved, but I've been doing this a while. And so we're trying to help people do that efficiently and give you some optionality about how you comply with the terms and conditions. So this says likely, but you should just say initial protocols. We are working on, we being eHealth, we're working on a governance protocol right now. We're also working on a change management protocol because we anticipate that in the first year or two of production, that there will be changes either to the SOPs or to the common agreement. We know that ONC is already working on version 2 of the common agreement. They've been very transparent about that. This is not a surprise. And so amending the common agreement requires participation of the QHINs, but also participants and sub-participants in the change management process. So every QHIN is going to have its internal change management process ready to go. And then, of course, security incident. ONC has been very intentional about setting a bar for security with TEFCA and arguably raising the bar. And we can debate that, right? But there's a lot of security language in the SOPs and the CA, and that's by design. And so we're working on our TEFCA security incident protocol. Shay, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Give my voice a rest.
All right, so I have just 3 concepts I wanted to cover first, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll have Lisa Berry facilitate a federal panel to hear what they're doing. So, when part of TEFCA requires that the QHINs look very thoroughly for potential patient matches. And when I first got involved in this, having worked for 2 EHR vendors and then a national provider, I was convinced that there's only one right way to do this, and doing anything else would be suboptimal, and very, very suboptimal. But I came to learn over the past year and a half while we've been researching this and analyzing this and looking at real numbers as we performed an analysis, that there's actually a preferred way of identifying patients that does not involve a traditional MPI where you have a list of all of the patients across the nation and simultaneously track where they have been treating. So there are 2 goals here that we're really having to balance, and this is probably worth a follow-up conversation with many of you to better understand it, especially with some of those who perform the analysis who are better able to articulate the findings and the process. But what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to balance 2 goals. So in my mind, if I were looking for a patient named Steve Gravely, I would say the right way to do it is to look in every nook and cranny across the US for Steve Gravely. I would check California and Oregon and Washington and Puerto Rico and Guam and so on and so forth. And I would want to raise or increase the number of potential Steve Graveleys there are across the US. But at the same time, because of the way that patient matching works and in EMPI engines, and because of the fact that the vast majority of the nation is no longer searching for patients with Social Security number or MRN numbers, which are pseudo unique identifiers, you've got to be really careful about false positives. So in other words, what you really don't want to have is you don't want to have a given responder say, hey, I've got 2, 3, or maybe 4 Steve Graveleys. Because if they have 2, 3, or 4, you run the risk of the responding system saying at 3 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I have lots of Steve Graveleys. I have 2. I don't know which one it is, so I'm just going to respond back with patient not found. And that means that you're not successful in finding the patient and helping with continuity of care or whatever your purpose is. So we performed a study, looked at the data, and decided to go with this approach. So if you look at the table here and the map, we have an assumption here. So we're assuming that in the very, very, very early days, and this is fictitious, that the eHealth Exchange QHIN is going to have QHIN participants in Alaska, Virginia, DC, Maryland, and Connecticut. Again, fictitious for illustration purposes. And so what we're planning to do is we're planning to periodically set the RLS scope. So what we're going to do is we're going to look in Alaska and Virginia and Maryland and DC and Connecticut, maybe every 6 months or so. And we're going to say, hey, if we look at the Alaska repository, how many patients do they have, how much care have they performed for patients with addresses outside of their service area? And so in this example, and again, it's fictitious, we're saying that the Alaska repository has patient records, 99% of whom have addresses in Alaska. In Maryland, we're saying, hey, they have 1% of their addresses for patients in Virginia because there's a lot of overlap. And then in Virginia, again, it doesn't quite align, but we're saying fictitiously that 99% of the patients have only a Virginia patient. So if we look at the scenarios, and we say in scenario 1 that we have a patient or a request for data for an Alaska patient, and no past addresses were found, we're going to look for that patient in Alaska only. We're not going to look in Maryland, and we're not going to look in Virginia. A second scenario here is that another QHIN requests data for a Maryland patient. And again, there are no past addresses. So we are going to query both Virginia, because the patient's current address is in Virginia. But then because Maryland has a significant number of its addresses in its database for Virginia patients, we're also going to search Maryland. In the third scenario, we're saying, hey, if another QHIN requests data and they are looking for a patient with a current Virginia address, and the request also says that the patient used to live or has records in Alaska, then we are going to request Alaska, because that's where the patient previously had an address. We're going to check in Virginia, because that's where the patient currently lives. And then because the Maryland HIE in this example also has a significant 1%, or whatever the number we choose, of patients with addresses in Virginia, we're going to check the Maryland HIE for that patient as well. So in that scenario number 3, we're going to check all 3 states. Scenario number 4 says that if another QHIN requests data for a patient with a current address in New Mexico and no past addresses, we're not going to query. And we're not going to query for a number of reasons. We're not going to query there because we have no presence in New Mexico. We don't have any health systems, any HIEs, or in this case, any federal agencies who have yet joined the eHealth Exchange QHIN. So we're going to return an automatic response saying, no, we don't have any patient data for this query. Virginia, Maryland, DC, Connecticut, and Alaska all say they have few to no addresses for patients in New Mexico. They're not in our service area, and so we're not going to query them. And so I'm guessing this is going to generate some questions, so I'll move on, but we'll definitely save time for questions. I also want to alert or remind the eHealth Exchange participants of some of the technical flow-down requirements for our QHIN.
Jay, you need to advance.
I'm sorry?
You need to advance.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, that was great. Our eHealth Exchange participants who elect to become a QHIN participant by not opting out are going to have to make some technical changes if they haven't already adopted these. So the first is adopting US CDI. There's the requirement for consolidated or concise consolidated CDA. There are the postal address standards. We think that this one might be accommodated already, but perhaps update the IHE specifications or the profiles to version 17. And then they do have to be able to accept aggregated XCPD responses. And there are a few other ones, or a number of other ones, but these are the major ones that we think are going to require the greatest amount of lift for the participants. And we're happy to schedule some sessions and walk through these more methodically with anyone who is interested. It's also important to stress that TEFCA has gone far beyond what eHealth Exchange, Care Quality, and other networks and frameworks have required. So there aren't firm dates for many of these, but above and beyond responding for treatment and individual requests, there are also going to be requirements to respond to requests for government benefit determination queries, and these are with an authorization. We're expecting the RCE to publish soon how we can better respond in volume to healthcare operations and payment queries, as well as to public health. And then there are going to be requirements to adhere to the TEFCA FHIR roadmap once it is finalized. So with that, it's probably a good time to move to questions and answers. So who has the first question?
Hey,
there you
Jay.
go. Oh, hey.
Quick question for you. On the technical slide that you were last on, is that a flow-down provision determined by eHealth Exchange, or are those provisions of those technical aspects, the V1 requirement and so on, set in the TEFCA?
Yeah, great question. So these all come from the QTF, but eHealth Exchange the eHealth Exchange hub has been able to remediate the vast majority of the QTF requirements. These are the ones that we think are better suited to be addressed as a technical flowdown by the eHealth Exchange participants. And over time, there might be some of these that we end up accommodating via the eHealth Exchange hub, but in the early days, this is the list of items that the participants will address.
Thank you. We've been thinking a lot about patient identity verification. I didn't hear anything here about IAL2 and how that might interplay on the exchange. Is there a roadmap, or can you share some thinking about that?
So I can tell you that IAL2 is required for the individual requests. So when another QHIN has an individual requesting data via an app or a web portal or whatever, it's up to that other QHIN who receives the request to ensure via IAL2 and other mechanisms that the patient really reasonably is who he or she say they are. So right now it's related only to the individual access use case. Is that helpful?
I was just wondering if there was, technical standard or anything, like how that information is going to get passed onto the exchange so that the counterparty can verify that IAL2 verification has been done.
Yeah, I don't remember. If anyone else does, feel free to raise your hand and answer the question. But it's I suspect that it's up to that the QHIN who's receiving the request does not pass on that data verbatim to the responding QHIN, but I could be mistaken.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I believe that the demographics are verified with a token that will be passed over to you in the SAML section. So it'll also iterate like which demographics have been verified by a CSP. So that might iterate over time. I know a lot of this has been driven by the patient matching work group with care quality. But yeah, I think at least so far as I know right now, that's what will happen.
All right, are there any other questions?
Hey Jay, hey everybody. So I was excited to see the targeted approach on how the hub will access patient records throughout the country, because that's certainly a challenge, so we don't end up doing these broadcast messages. So in addition to just state boundaries, what else have you guys looked at? Zip codes, Dartmouth hospital referral regions, some of the other things that, I live in North Florida, borders right up to Georgia, so we've got so much crossover between state lines, and they've been somewhat arbitrary in a lot of cases. So I'd love to hear other thoughts or.
Yeah, so this will we'll have a fluid solution. So, we're planning to start out with this, with this scenario where Florida and Georgia and probably other states certainly have overlap, especially at borders. So Georgia, I would guess, has 1% or plus of patients who live in Florida. But above and beyond that, I should have clarify that this is called a geospatial approach. So we can update it based on tables that we have in any number of ways. We can do a radius-based approach, you know, within X miles of the patient's home or the provider's location. We could also use the Dartmouth Atlas hospital referral regions concept, where we look at where historically, based on billing records, how far patients really travel. So, you know, if you live in Wyoming, there's a good chance you're getting your care in Denver, Colorado, or in Omaha, Nebraska, an entire state away, or maybe in Montana. But we are able to populate those tables with a variety of different approaches instead of just going state by state, if we think it makes sense.
Hey, Jay. Michael Marchant, UC Davis. A different flavor of what's kind of a similar question from the other day. So an existing current eHealth Exchange customer may or may not opt in to your, let's just pretend I opt out. I'm opted out. Is it a parallel track for existing customers and your new TEFCA QHIN customers, assuming you're approved and all the other things? What does that look like 9 months from now as an opted out customer that's currently leveraging eHealth Exchange? Are those two separate solutions? Do they cross over? Is it a parallel process? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, if I understand the question properly, we have routing rules in the eHealth Exchange hub that accommodate that. So, at your organization in California, I would think 6 months, 9 months, a year down the road, you're still going to be getting this exact same level of volume with your exchange, but it won't be in with TEFCA. So if there are any organizations that exchange exclusively via TEFCA, you know, you're not going to be able to exchange with them. But if they're part of the eHealth Exchange network or part of the Care Equality network, you'll still be exchanging with them.
But if they opt in to your QHIN, thank you. But if they're current a customer that opts into the QHIN, do then they become non-eHealth Exchange partners?
I see.
And then do we not have access to their data? Again, assuming that we're not leveraging those queries through our QHIN.
Yeah, okay, that's a fantastic question. No. So an organization has to join eHealth Exchange as a participant and honor the DIRSA's duty to respond. And then above and beyond that, they have the supplemental options to exchange with Care Equality, with TEFCA, both, or none. But they have to be an eHealth Exchange, I'll call it base participant.